Welcome back to another M&S tutoring video, and in this video we're going to be learning how to solve quadratic equations. We're going to be learning how to solve quadratic equations with 3 different methods, and each method will be applied with the best scenario used to solve it. So let's begin with the first method, which is called the zero method. The zero method revolves around factoring, and if you do not know how to factor, you can watch my previous video and learn, because the zero method involves a lot of factoring. Well, when is this method the best to use? Well, of course, this method is the best to use when it is factorable. You have to make sure it is factorable, because if it's not, you'll be better off either completing the square or using the quadratic equation to solve. Another thing you have to look for is if it's in the form of ax squared plus bx plus c is equal to 0. If there is a constant on the other side of the equation, you're going to be better off by either completing the square or using the quadratic equation, as it takes more than one step to just factor it if there's a constant on the right side. How do you actually solve the equation though with factoring? Well, it's quite simple actually. Let's look at an example. Say you have the equation x squared plus, minus 5x plus 6 is equal to 0. Well, we know that this is factorable, as m times n is equal to 6 and m plus n is equal to -5. And there can be a whole number for m and n that prove both of these equations to be correct. So we know that it can be factorable. It is also in the form of ax squared plus bx plus c. So we know we can use the zero method or a factoring method to solve this quadratic equation. So all you have to do in this is you have to factor it. You can use any method to factor it. You can use either decomposition or simply factor it as a simple trinomial as it is. So let's factor it right now. If you want to factor this, we need to come up with any two numbers, and in this case it's going to be m and n that equal to -5. So as I mentioned before, m plus n is equal to -5, and m times n is equal to 6. Well, m times n is equal to 6. You can have either 3 and 2. You can have -3 and -2. You can have 6 and 6, or you can have 6 and 1. You can have 6 and 1, or you can have -6 and -1. If you look at it, the two numbers that can give you a sum, or when put together give you -5, would be, of course, -3 and -2. So we're going to use this as m and n. And if we use these as m and n, you should know that the general factored form when you're using a simple trinomial is x plus m factored x plus n. And since we know m in this case is -3 and n in this case is -2, we can simply write it as x minus 3 and x minus 2. Now that we have factored the simple trinomial, let's move on to solving it. As of right now, we have x minus 3 factored x minus 2 is equal to 0. But how do we go on to solve this? Well, you can look at it as a bracket. What this basically means is that A, let's call this bracket over here A, and let's call this bracket over here B. What this basically means is you have to try and make either one of the brackets to 0. So when you multiply it with the other bracket, you get an answer of 0, making this equation correct. So to make either one of the brackets to 0, you simply isolate each one as to 0 and you forget about the other bracket. So you can write this equation as x minus 3 is equal to 0, and you can write x minus 2 is equal to 0. And you can go on to solve both these different equations to get two answers for x. And as we know, the solution to a quadratic equation either has one answer, two answers, or zero answers. And since we have two different brackets, we know that this quadratic equation has two different answers. So in this case, x can be 3 or x can be 2, right? And if we verify this, we can plug x in for 3, and we can, if we plug x in for 3, this x over here turns into a 3. This whole bracket is a 0 now, and 0 times whatever is in this bracket makes 0. So it makes sense. And with the 2, we can do the same thing to bracket B and make the product on the left 0, making this equation true. So let's move on and learn how to use the completing the square method to solve simple quadratics. Completing the square is very similar to the quadratic formula. In fact, the quadratic formula is basically isolating for x when you're completing the square in the quadratic form. So the quadratic formula was in fact derived from completing the square. Well, how do you complete the square, and when can you use this method in solving simple quadratics? Well, completing the square, as the name may suggest, is completing the left side of the equation so that it's a perfect square, so that you can take square root of both sides of the equation to find an answer. So let's say you have a simple quadratic equation with the coefficient of x squared is 1. You have an equation of, let's say, x squared plus 4x plus 2 is equal to 9, right? You have this equation. This completing the square method usually works best when there is a constant on the right side of the equation, right? To complete the square, you need to remember, I mentioned this in my factoring video, you need to remember that the square root of c times the square root of a times 2 should equal b to make it a perfect square. So what you're going to do now to complete the square first is move all the constants, so any whole numbers without a variable beside them, to the right side of the equation. So you can write it as x squared plus 4x is equal to 9 minus 2, right? So this simplifies to be x squared plus 4x is equal to 7, right? Now what you want to do is you want to remember that b is equal to the square root of c times the square root of a times 2. So if we take the square root of a, in this case a is 1 and c is 4, right? So if we take the square root of c, which in this case is which is 4 in this case, we can get a simplified version of x squared plus 4x plus bracket 4 over 2 squared. This is basically an expanded version of a perfect square trinomial. Remember, if we add 4 over 2 squared to the left side of the equation, we also have to add the same thing to the right side of the equation. So we have to write it as 7 plus 4 over 2 squared on the right side as well. Now, the left side of this equation can be factored into a very simple trinomial. It can be factored into x plus 2 squared is equal to 7 plus 4, of course, because the right side can also be simplified. And when you simplify this even further, you get x plus 2 squared is equal to 7 plus 4, which is 11. Now that you have a square on the left side of the equation, a perfect square on the left side, and a constant on the right side, you can take the square root of both sides of the equation. You can square root x plus 2 squared, and you can also square root 11, right? When you square root x plus 2 squared, you simply just get x plus 2. And when you square root 11, remember, we can get either the positive square root of 11 or the negative square root of 11. And when we simplify this equation, we get two answers for x again. We either get x is equal to negative 2 plus negative 11, or x is equal to negative 2 minus the square root of 11, right? So again, these are the two answers to this first quadratic equation I gave you, and we have solved this using completing the square. Well, how do we complete the square if the coefficient of x is not 1? Because it makes it a lot harder. Well, all you have to do is in the start, rather than actually adding or moving any of the coefficients to the other side, we simply just divide the whole equation by the coefficient of x squared, making it in the form of a simple trinomial. So that's all it is. If it's a complex quadratic, you can still complete the square. Just remember that anything you add to the left side of the equation, you have to do to the right as well. So whenever you add the c factor to the left side, you also have to remember to do it to the right side. Now let's look at how to solve using the quadratic formula. The quadratic formula is by far the most simple way to solve a quadratic equation, because all you have to do is plug numbers into a formula and eventually calculate it. Well, some things that you didn't know about the quadratic formula was it was actually derived from completing the square. So all you have to do when you complete the square for ax squared plus bx plus c, you get the quadratic formula. For those of you who don't know, the quadratic formula is x is equal to negative b plus minus the square root of b squared minus 4ac. All of that over 2a, right? Now, some of you may be asking, what is b, what is a, what is c? Well, all of those are the general numbers of a quadratic equation. So ax squared plus bx plus c. So if you have an equation, let's say 3x squared minus 36x plus, let's say 64. Well, if you have an equation like this, a is, in this case, a is 3. B is negative 36 and C is 64. All you have to do to solve using the quadratic equation, you have to plug in all the variables for what the variables are in the quadratic equation itself, and you simply just solve for x. And those are the three ways you can solve a quadratic equation, from everything from completing the square to actually factoring the equation itself. Thanks for watching the video, guys. If you have any comments or concerns, please feel free to leave it down in the comments below.